Right, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this evening's event, which is being hosted by the One World Centre. We are a small independent education charity, a development education centre based in Dundee, one of 5 similar centres across Scotland. We work to promote global justice and equality by supporting schools and community groups to engage in global citizenship education. Using the participated methods of global learning, we encourage young people to challenge stereotypes and to explore the interconnections between people and place. We aim to foster a lifelong commitment to a more just, equitable and sustainable world. And we know that when people are encouraged to find their voice, they can find ways to actively bring about change, both locally and internationally. And so I'm really looking forward to what Professor Jim Skea has to tell us this evening.
It's nice to be back in Dundee again, even if it's only on Zoom. As you can probably tell by my accent, I come from that part of the world. My kind of day job is at Imperial College London, but actually I'm pretty much spending all of my time on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the moment. And I'm also was chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission, which reported in March. And just as of a week ago, I was appointed again to chair the commission in its next phase, which I'll talk about a little. So what I'm going to do is talk just a little bit about my 2 roles, so you can kind of see where I'm coming from, and then I'll focus specifically on COP26 in Glasgow and how some of these things I'm involved in are going to play into that. I chose that very pretentious title, which you always regret at the end of the day, but let me try to live up to it, if only partly. So just to say about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it would take an hour to explain how it works. But basically, there are 3 working groups in IPCC. And the one that I'm involved in looks at how you cut emissions and increasingly how you take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And IPCC involves hundreds upon hundreds of scientists, but it's actually owned by governments because the I stands for intergovernmental. So it's quite an interesting, complex relationship. We work in 7-year cycles. That's how long people are elected for. And these are the 4 reports that we've produced so far in the 6th assessment cycle, which started in 2015. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I was involved in sort of leading on scientifically on the report on 1.5 degree warming on the left. My group in London and also colleagues in Ahmedabad in India managed the special report on climate change and land, which is second from the left. And the one that's got a lot of publicity very recently is the one from our colleagues in Working Group 1, which looks after the physical science. And that's the one that just came out a month ago and gained a lot of publicity. So my role is I'm co-chair of Working Group 3, which looks after mitigation. And my fellow co-chair is an Indian guy called Priyadarshi Shukla, who's based at the University of Ahmedabad. And we've known each other for a long time. And in fact, because of Zoom, we now have a technical support unit that covers India and London, and we just work seamlessly together without ever really thinking about where we actually are. So what did IPCC say so far in this cycle that's going to feed into COP26? Well, this is a classic scientist diagram from the special report on warming of 1.5 degrees. And it shows a lot of projections of global carbon dioxide emissions right out through the 21st century. And it shows what the pathways would need to be if you were going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which many people have told us, would avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. So the big headlines there from that, if you look at the middle of the curves, that blue band on the left-hand diagram, it means you need to reach the fabled net zero carbon dioxide emissions by about the middle of this century. And by 2030, and now in less than 10 years' time, emissions would have to fall by about 45%, nearly half from current levels. And that 45% reduction by 2030 gave rise to all the headlines about 12 years to save the world, which we didn't actually say, but at least, but though other people said it, it certainly helped to publicize the work we've done. And this report on 1.5 degrees, we didn't decide to do it. The convention, the people who meet at COP, asked us to actually do it. So it was in response to all the policymakers that this report was produced. And they have been making use of it in all their subsequent discussions. So on the right-hand side, the carbon dioxide isn't the only greenhouse gas that we put into the atmosphere. We also need to see reductions of other things, especially methane in the top right-hand corner, which comes from, from cattle and from leaking from oil and gas pipes as well. So that needs to be addressed as well. Now, the other report that came out a month ago, I've decided not to include anything on the content of the report. We'll just focus on the impact of it, which was absolutely unprecedented. 2 days before we even published the report, there were more newspaper headlines than there'd ever been for any IPCC report that had ever been published. And this was very much the message that, unless we really act immediately, the world is going to be more than 1.5 degrees warmer. So some of the worst outcomes will be there unless we act in a really urgent kind of way. And this, I think, was a message that really fed into the people who are preparing for COP26 in Glasgow, which will be starting in early November. So that's what I do with IPCC, and it very much plays into COP26 because the politicians and the technocrats who go there pay a lot of attention to this kind of material. Now, the other thing, if IPCC puts my head in the clouds, the Scottish Just Transition Commission has kept my feet very firmly on the ground in terms of thinking about the practicalities of what this all means. Now, following on, immediately when IPCC published that report on 1.5 degrees, Scotland set a target to move to a net zero economy by 2045, 5 years quicker than the UK as a whole. So it was very much following up on that message in the graph that I was showing you about how the world would need to get to net zero by the middle of this century if you were going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But of course, these kind of changes, imply really big changes to social and economic systems, and they raise important issues about justice. So what the Just Transition Commission was set up to do was to provide, pick the words out, practical, realistic and affordable recommendations for Scottish ministers to think about how they combined moving to a net zero economy by 2045 with maximising the economic and social opportunities that potentially go there, moving into renewable energy, other kinds of land use opportunities are there. Building on existing strength and assets, and actually oil and gas in the North Sea is something that Scotland and the UK has done rather well, even if it's not very much in line with carbon dioxide reduction. And whether all these skills can be reapplied for a low carbon economy was a big part of the question. So, and the other one was to understand, people will be at risk, the economy will change. We had an estimate that about 10% of Scottish jobs would say the demand for their skills going down in a zero carbon economy. And that raises big issues for equality, poverty, and the way that the labour market works, with implications for skills and training. And just to say, the commission, the members of it, it wasn't a bunch of academics, though there were 2 or 3 academics on it. It was people from the trade unions, it was people from NGOs, it was people from business, and 2 or 3 academics to fill it out. And it's very interesting that although that was a really diverse group, we managed to stay with a consensus the whole way and produce a set of consensus recommendations for the Scottish ministers. And we reported in March this year, just before we went into the election. So what did we recommend? We came up with 24 recommendations all in all, which you'll be relieved to hear I'm not going to go through one by one. So what we did to make it a bit simpler is that we tried to group them into sort of 4 themes that made it a bit easier to present. So one of them was about planning for a net zero future. And we're well aware that some of the transitions that have taken place in Scotland in the past, including the way that we got out of the coal industry, was definitely an unjust transition. And so the big message we had there is you needed to plan, because unplanned transitions tend to be unjust transitions. So that was a strong set of recommendations there. The second recommendation is that people need the right kind of skills and education to benefit from the transition. And that was both about getting training during mid-career to move over, so that, for example, people who'd been working in the offshore oil and gas industry could move over and work on offshore wind, for example, so they could make that transfer. So that mid-career training and certificating people to be able to do that was an important part of it. But we also, I think it's more relevant for the One World Centre, we also emphasised early years training as well, so that people, were prepared for a labour market in which sustainability and net zero were an important part of the future. So that was, one side was planning, another side was skills and education. And the third element, one of the things that we strongly emphasize, just transition, it's basically about fairness and equity and justice. And it's been applied as a concept in many parts of the world, but mainly in the context of regions getting out of coal. For example, in South Africa, in Upper Silesia, in Poland, Galicia and Spain are all places that apply just transition principles. But Scotland's got out of coal already because Llangannat Power Station shut in 2016. So we have another agenda that's more around the oil and gas industry, but it's also, we wanted to extend it not only to include the production side of the economy, we also wanted to cover consumers and communities as well, because the sense of place is really important. So we had recommendations in there about green participatory budgeting at the local authority level and other kinds of initiatives to try and make sure that people could feel that they owned a transition to a net zero economy. And the final one was about sharing the benefits widely and ensuring that burdens are distributed on the basis of ability to pay. Because a net zero transition will, to some extent, need to be paid for, though the costs are a lot less than people previously anticipated. But for example, all of the costs of renewable energy and efficiency so far have been borne by electricity consumers, pretty much all of it. And if people have no choice but to use electricity, that has a kind of a regressive effect on the way that the costs are following on people. So we had a set of recommendations, at least how to track that. And it's worthwhile saying the Scottish government sometimes can't do much about that at the moment. It's more up to the UK government, but the Scottish government can try to put pressure on. Right. So when when commissions like this operate, maybe half the recommendations got taken up, but we were surprised and the fact that when the new government came in after the elections, they said that they accepted the recommendations 100%. So we were kicking ourselves and wishing we'd asked for more, because the take up was so big. So as a result of that, we've got a minister for just transition, employability and fair work, Richard Lochhead. The commission has been re-established to scrutinise what government is doing and advise it on how to monitor and evaluate the just transition. We've got a national just transition planning framework in place, which under the umbrella of which there will be sectoral just transition plans. And the first just transition plan, as we recommended, will start with the energy sector, because that big issue of getting out of oil and gas, which Scotland faces. The government's already got a climate emergency skills action plan going to try and get people in there. They've picked up on green participatory budgeting, and they will be tracking the impacts of decarbonisation on household budgets to make sure that no one category of consumer is unduly affected by that. So I can just say we were really pleased with the outcome there. And I'll flag, going into COP26, there's been a huge amount of international attention to what Scotland has been doing there in advancing the just transition idea. And I've spent a lot of time in Zoom meetings like this with peoples in other parts of Europe, people with the Ohio Valley in the United States that has some of the similar issues, on a bizarre one with at a meeting chaired by the Icelandic Prime Minister, because Iceland is very interested in the concept, as well. So if I can jump from these, both the IPCC and the just transition stuff is playing into COP26 in one way. But I'll use the second half of the talk just to talk about what COP26 actually is and how it operates and what difference you might expect it to make. So that's the site of where the COP26, the Conference of the Parties, for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to give it its full title, is going to take place. And these COPs, though it might be less because of COVID, are really big events. The last ones, we've had 25,000 people going to them. So it's like a small town, basically, in terms of the size of it. And once you get inside these buildings with all these people, I have to say, it feels like the EK shopping mall in East Kilbride. It's that kind of crowded feeling, people moving around the corridor, rushing around, talking to each other on mobile phones. It's a very kind of dynamic and busy kind of atmosphere. But with 25,000 people at a meeting like that, it needs a bit of structure and, quite frankly, a bit of hierarchy as well in the way that it actually operates. So what's actually going on? Is it just a political platform for politicians? Is it where all the civil servants get together to do all the technical detail? Is it a place where NGOs go to lobby the political system? Or is it just a kind of festival that celebrates, the kind of action that's taking place in climate change? And the truth is, it's all of these things at once. And that is quite a difficult thing to arrange, as you can imagine. So the first thing is to say that physically, it's divided into a so-called blue zone and a green zone. And to get into the blue zone, you either have to be a government delegate or you have to be accredited as an observer. So these are the only people who get into the blue zone, which is where the negotiations take place. So, and even then, not everybody can get into all of the negotiations. There's one very big room where the main negotiations take place, but there's lots of side meetings. And even if you're an observer, you can't get into all the side meetings. So it's a little bit you're kind of exclusive to that extent. And then there's a green zone, which is separate, which anybody can get into, which is where a lot of NGOs set up stall and talk to each other about what they're doing. So that division between the blue zone and the green zone is quite a big one. And within the blue zone, there's still quite a bit of hierarchy about who goes to which actual meeting. So if I can just say what is going on, in each of these places. Well, these are what the negotiations look like. And I've been so many of them, and IPCC meetings sometimes look a bit like that as well. On the left-hand side, the big plenary room, that was at the last COP, which was in Madrid. Several hundred people in a big room, all the countries sitting in their delegations listed by alphabetical order, and some of the observer organizations at the back, and the whole thing translated simultaneously into the six UN languages. But that can be a bit formal and stilted. What really goes on is the stuff on the right-hand side, all the deals being done in the corridors and the private meeting rooms. And I've also been into many huddles like that on the right-hand side for IPCC, which is where a lot of the detailed business is going on. And just to say, I mean, the politicians will come and address this. One of the clever things the French did, at the Paris Agreement back in 2015, was they got the politicians in there on the first 2 days to set the tone. And that is what's actually going to happen in Glasgow. World Leaders' Days will be on the 1st Monday and Tuesday of the conference on the 1st and 2nd of November. They'll be there. Then they'll leave behind all the people to do the much more technical detail around the negotiations. So what are they going to be negotiating on? So just to remind ourselves, what about the Paris Agreement, which is the big, agreed in 2015, and almost all governments have signed up to it. I think perhaps not North Korea, but there are broadly 3 goals for the Paris Agreement. The first one is about reducing emissions and limiting global warming to well below 2 and pursuing efforts to keep it down to 1.5 degrees, to quote the exact words. Increasingly, there's been a focus on net zero emissions and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, a lot of people generally assume that's the main purpose of the Paris Agreement and all the negotiations, but the Paris Agreement actually has 2 other goals that are very important in terms of justice at a global level and the role of developing countries. So the first one is increasing the ability of countries to adapt to climate change, because we know it's going to happen. And this is a particular concern, particularly for countries like the small island developing states in the South Pacific, the Maldives, the Caribbean, who are going to be being really impacted by that. So there's one of the goals is to increase their ability to adapt to climate change. And the third one, which is very important also, is to make financial flows from developed countries to developing countries to help developing countries compensate for the kind of problems that they're going to have. And the reason that these 3 goals are all interlocking is that the developing countries will not go on with the first target unless they're assured that money is actually starting to flow. And the Paris Agreement set a goal of about 100 billion a year financial flows from developed to developing countries by 2020, which I don't think has been realized. And that's one of the reasons why there's a bit of lack of trust between developed and developing countries at the moment. The whole thing is driven by nationally determined contributions. So countries make their offers in terms of what they're going to do in terms of these goals, and then they're periodically added up to see if the whole global picture is there. And basically, the UK's goal as the presidency of COP26 is to make sure that there's progress on all of these things, to make sure that countries' offers in terms of reducing emissions are roughly in line with 2 or 1.5 degrees. And also to make sure that developed countries step up to the mark in terms of financial flows. And at the bottom, there's a very technical thing. There's a rule book for implementing the Paris Agreement. And there's one particular very tendentious element that has not been agreed so far. These are the words from Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It's actually about emissions trading, which is quite controversial and would follow up from the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And there's questions there about the integrity, do people really do what they promise to do when these outcomes are transferred? So this is a difficult one for the UK to solve as well. Now, just to say, are we making progress on that? You'll remember that slide I showed from IPCC, which showed that emissions need to drop by, say, about 45% by 2030. Just last week, the convention took stock of all the nationally determined contributions it's had, and it added them up to see what they added up to by 2030. And although there's been progress over the last 5 years, we are still nowhere near the kind of 45% reduction by 2030 that you would need. Emissions by 2030 would be roughly the same level as the 2019 level at the best in the best outcome, according to that analysis. So the big message is progress, but it's not nearly enough to achieve the overall objectives of the Paris Agreement, which is why Boris Johnson and Alok Sharma have been chasing around the world trying to persuade people to come on board and step up their offers. I'll just say it's not only the negotiations, and you just to flag up, other groups are moving to COP26 as well, and there are observer organisations which can get in there to basically to see what's going on, but also to lobby governments and try to influence the process. And many of the observers will actually have pavilions inside the COP26 in the blue zone, at which they're having meetings in which they get stakeholders together to try to develop solutions. So there are three types of observers. There's the UN observers. They're people like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, International Energy Agency, and IPCC actually counts as a UN observer. That's the kind of ticket I go in on. There are other, intergovernmental organizations. World Bank, Asian Development Bank fall into that category. There are about 150 of these organizations, and there are other NGOs, of which there are many, 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 and that will include people like Worldwide Fund for WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, Friends of the Earth. And the observers divide themselves up into so-called constituencies, which gives rise to lots of acronyms. The bingos, the engos, the tungos, the ringos, the youngos are all in there. And basically each of these groups, what they tend to do, they tend to get together at 8 o'clock every morning and check with each other what they saw happening in the conference the day before, and make their plans to fan out and try to influence the negotiations. And obviously they're coming from very different places. So for me, in IPCC, we actually engage every time with the business and industry NGOs and the environmental NGOs, business and industry through the International Chamber of Commerce, the environmental NGOs through Climate Action Network International. But as to say, with the Just Transition initiatives are also of great interest to the trade union NGOs on the right-hand side. And, my employer, Imperial College, is actually registered as an observer under the Research and Independent NGOs, the so-called Ringos, which is obviously nothing to do with the Beatles. So just to say, getting to the end here, and I hope I'm on time, we can't go on without mentioning the role of civil society and everybody else who turns up to the meetings. And quite frankly, much of which takes place in the green zone, is the liveliest part of the meeting, which I would guess that many people here, if they were going to go to COP26, would there. So left-hand side, developing country NGOs saying rich companies have to pay their debts. That's what they're kind of saying. People at the top right-hand corner are people who don't like emissions trading at all. So they don't want Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to be implemented at all. They're lobbying for that because of the lack of assurance. And at the bottom right-hand corner, people lobbying for an exit from the coal industry. So it is a very lively affair. And I hope to say that there's a bit of expectations management kind of running from the UK government and the COP26 presidency at the moment about the outcomes. But in the negotiating level, this is where we would see the advance in terms of upping the ambition and trying to make the financial flows move a bit more readily. Just to say, Scotland will be featured there. The Just Transition Commission, now at work, and other things the Scottish Government will be doing will feature in meetings, both in the blue zone and outside the blue zone in other venues as well, where I think they're planning about a 4-day set of events which the Scottish Government will put in place. So it is an exciting kind of thing. I'm lucky to be able to go there with 2 different hats on and be part of it. And just say, if you are interested and you're not in Glasgow to go there, there's a very easy way of following it. There's a wonderful Canadian NGO called the International Institute for Sustainable Development that actually produces an Earth Negotiations bulletin every day at all the environmental conferences that matter around the world, including COP26. And every day they will post a bulletin on what has been going on with lots of pictures of what the delegates are up to. And I can assure you the delegates look at it ferociously every day to see if they manage to get their picture into the Earth Negotiations bulletin. It really kind of matters to them. But that's the website. Once it starts, you can go there and there'll be a report every day. So I don't know if I fulfilled any of the expectations I created with that title of the presentation, but I'm happy to stop there.